Movies love to show medieval battles as perfectly organized, dramatic clashes filled with flawless knights and endless sword fights. But real warfare in the Middle Ages looked nothing like that. The truth was far messier, far more brutal, and far more human than Hollywood ever admits. Today, we're breaking down 5 major things movies consistently get wrong about medieval battles, and what really happened on those chaotic, unforgiving battlefields. Number 1. The myth of perfectly synchronized charging. Movies almost always imagine medieval warfare as something clean, choreographed, and almost rehearsed, but nothing about real medieval battles worked the way Hollywood shows them. When you see 2 armies running straight toward each other in those perfect movie lines, all shields aligned, all spears held at the same angle, that image is closer to a staged performance than anything that ever happened in the Middle Ages. Real terrain was messy. The ground wasn't flat or carefully prepared. It was full of dips, mud, tall grass, loose rocks, animal burrows, farm ruts, and leftover debris from previous fighting. Soldiers constantly tripped or lost footing because medieval battlefields were never designed as open arenas. Even a slight slope could completely break the momentum of a charge, and many historical battles were fought on terrain that today would look almost unusable. Another major problem with Hollywood's idea of synchronized charging is the simple fact that medieval soldiers were exhausted long before the big clash. Troops marched for days or weeks, carrying heavy equipment, often with limited food and water. Armor added additional weight, and many soldiers arrived at battle already worn out. Maintaining perfect formation under those conditions was impossible. Even the best-trained knights could only stay aligned for short distances before uneven ground, or sudden obstacles forced them to adjust. You also have to consider that medieval commanders couldn't micromanage the battlefield the way modern generals can. There were no radios, no satellite views, no modern signaling equipment. Orders were shouted through wind and dust, carried by messengers who might be wounded or delayed, or signaled with flags and horns that were easy to misinterpret. A simple gust of wind, a loud clash, or even the echo off a hill could distort a signal. By the time an order reached the back ranks, the front ranks might already be engaged or facing new threats. Movies also exaggerate how often soldiers charged at full speed. A full sprint in heavy equipment is extremely draining, and commanders knew that tired soldiers were vulnerable soldiers. Infantry typically advanced in controlled steps to keep their ranks aligned and avoid breaking cohesion. If they ran, it was usually only near the very end, the last few meters before contact. And even then, not all units ran at the same speed. Cavalry charges, which movies love to depict as wild stampedes, were actually carefully timed and controlled. Knights didn't want their lines to break apart before impact, and horses weren't pushed into reckless sprints unless the terrain was ideal and the situation demanded it. Sometimes cavalry charged at a trot or canter because what mattered wasn't top speed, but the mass and timing of the strike. Hollywood often turns cavalry into uncontrollable projectiles, but real knights knew that an uncoordinated charge could result in disaster. Another misconception is the idea that medieval soldiers could run long distances in armor without slowing down. Armor, whether mail or plate, was well balanced but still heavy. After even a short sprint, a soldier's breathing became ragged. Helmets limited airflow. Padded underarmor trapped heat. Sweat built up fast. Many troops entered battle already overheated or out of breath. So when film scenes show soldiers running across massive fields and then fighting with full power immediately after, that's pure fantasy. In reality, most troops reached the enemy tired, sweaty, and gasping. This fatigue shaped how they fought. Swings were shorter, shields stayed closer to the body, and footwork became limited. Once the two sides collided, everything broke down even further. Movies often show a clean, wall-to-wall moment where two armies meet, clash once, and then spread into neat little duels. Real combat didn't separate that cleanly. The first few rows smashed together with a chaotic force, and soldiers behind them were pushed forward by the pressure of the formation. People fell, stumbled into their own comrades, dropped weapons, or were knocked down by the weight of bodies behind them. Those who fell had seconds to recover before being trampled. The battlefield turned into a compressed, grinding struggle of pushing and shoving where visibility dropped to almost nothing. The idea that armies moved with perfect coordination comes largely from modern filmmaking needs. A chaotic mass of bodies doesn't look visually clear, so directors simplify everything. But the truth is that medieval warfare was a swirling mess of confusion, dust, noise, and fear. Even experienced soldiers often couldn't see more than the few people directly in front of them. Formations warped, bent, and collapsed under pressure. Units lost track of each other. What began as a straight line became a jagged wave within seconds. The cinematic version of synchronized charging exists because it looks visually satisfying, not because it has historical accuracy. When you strip away movie magic and look at first-hand accounts from medieval chroniclers, the picture becomes far more human and far more chaotic. Soldiers didn't glide across the battlefield. They slogged, stumbled, and crashed their way towards survival, not cinematic perfection. Number 2. Armor was not the clumsy tin can people imagine. One of the most common myths about the Middle Ages is that armor turned knights into stiff robots who could barely move. But real historical armor, especially once plate armor became widespread, was surprisingly flexible, mobile, and intelligently designed. Medieval armorers were highly skilled craftsmen who spent years perfecting their techniques. They shaped plates to match the natural curves of the human body, overlapped segments to allow bending at the elbows and knees, and used straps, hinges, and rivets to create armor that functioned almost like an exoskeleton. A knight in full plate could run, climb, swing weapons, vault onto a horse, and even fall without instantly becoming helpless. Movies usually mix up two very different types of armor: combat armor and tournament armor. Tournament armor, used for jousts and sporting events, was extremely thick and heavy because it needed to absorb direct hits from lances. That specialized armor truly restricted movement, but it was never intended for war. Combat armor, on the other hand, needed to be light enough for mobility, durable enough to deflect strikes, and comfortable enough to wear for hours. Some full-plate armor weighed around 20-25 kilograms, distributed evenly over the body, which is similar to the weight carried by modern soldiers. The weight wasn't unbearable or crippling. Soldiers trained in it regularly and built strong conditioning from childhood. Hollywood also misrepresents how weapons interacted with armor. A sword slicing through steel plate is impossible. Steel plate of good quality deflected most cuts, and even thrusts had to target vulnerable areas like the armpits, groin, or visor slits. Because plate armor was so effective, medieval combat techniques evolved accordingly. Knights used half-swording to guide their blade precisely into armor gaps. They wrestled, hooked, and leveraged opponents to the ground. They used daggers specialized for stabbing into armor joints. Manuals from the 14th and 15th centuries confirmed these methods in detail. Movies also dramatize arrows piercing plate armor like it's paper, but historical tests and records contradict that. At normal battlefield distances, a longbow arrow had little chance of penetrating high-quality plate. Arrows were far more dangerous to lightly armored infantry, horses, and exposed areas. The true strength of English longbowmen at battles like Agincourt wasn't armor penetration, it was volume. Thousands of arrows fired every few seconds caused panic, chaos, injuries, and fatigue. They disrupted formations and forced knights into unfavorable terrain. The longbow's psychological impact mattered just as much as its physical damage. Weapons designed specifically to counter armor were blunt force weapons. Warhammers, maces, flanged axes, and picks were developed because they could bend or crack armor, transmit shock through it, or hook into weak spots. Movies almost never show this type of fighting, yet these tools were extremely common in the late Middle Ages. Knights knew exactly what weapons worked against plate and carried them accordingly. Another Hollywood exaggeration is how oppressive armor supposedly felt in terms of heat. Yes, it got warm, but armor had padding that absorbed sweat and provided space for air to circulate. Knights trained for years to manage heat and endurance. Their lifestyle involved riding, hunting, practicing combat, and maintaining fitness. They weren't amateurs who suddenly put on armor once a year like an actor. Real knights were conditioned athletes. Armor also offered protection beyond what movies admit. Against many weapons, plate armor made knights nearly invulnerable from the front. A knight in good armor, supported by a disciplined formation, could push through missile fire and survive intense fighting. That's one reason knights dominated European battlefields for centuries. Hollywood often portrays them as clumsy targets, but in reality, they were elite shock troops with some of the best personal protection in human history. The truth is that medieval armor wasn't an outdated relic. It was advanced engineering. Each piece was custom-made, fitted precisely to the wearer, and adapted for the demands of real combat. Knights weren't clumsy metal figures stumbling around. They were highly mobile, dangerous warriors who relied on a combination of armor, skill, and strategy. When we correct this misconception, medieval warfare becomes much easier to understand because armor wasn't a limitation. It was an advantage. Number 3. Battles weren't just endless sword fights. Movies almost always portray medieval combat as dramatic one-on-one sword fights that last several minutes. But historical close combat looked nothing like those cinematic scenes. Real sword fights were brutally fast. A handful of movements decided the outcome. Most duels ended in seconds because soldiers aimed for efficiency, not style. A wide, dramatic swing left you open, wasted stamina, and risked losing balance. Real fighters rarely used such moves. Instead, they relied on thrusts, quick cuts, grappling techniques, shield strikes, and footwork designed to stay alive rather than perform. The biggest misconception is the sword's role itself. In popular imagination, swords are the main medieval weapon. In reality, spears were the king of the battlefield. Spears offered reach, required relatively little training, and were extremely effective in tight formations. A well-drilled spear wall could stop cavalry, repel infantry charges, and hold ground far more efficiently than swords. This is why armies across Europe, from the English to the Swiss to the Norse, relied heavily on spears and pikes to control engagements. Swords were sidearms, not primary weapons. Polearms were another essential but overlooked part of medieval warfare. Weapons like halberds, bills, glaives, and poleaxes combined cutting blades, hooks, and hammering surfaces with long reach. They were designed specifically to deal with armored opponents, giving infantry the ability to challenge knights effectively. Hollywood rarely includes these weapons because they're less recognizable than swords. But in real battles, they were among the most feared tools a soldier could face. Shields also functioned very differently from what films show. Instead of being used as oversized battering rams or accessories for dramatic poses, shields were mobile barriers. Soldiers angled them to catch incoming strikes, hid behind them to protect the legs and torso, and used them to create defensive walls in formation. Shield work was a highly trained discipline, involving subtle motions and constant adjustments. Shield walls, lines of interlocked shields, were devastating in the early Middle Ages, and remained effective in later periods when combined with spears or pikes. Real combat also involved far more wrestling and physical grappling than movies depict. Medieval martial arts, documented in surviving manuals from masters like Fiore de Liberi and Hans Talhofer, show fighters using throws, joint locks, trips, and even ground fighting techniques. Grappling allowed warriors to exploit the weight of armor, control an opponent's weapon, or expose gaps for a finishing blow. Some battles involved soldiers literally dragging enemies to the ground and overpowering them by sheer physical force. Another major Hollywood myth is stamina. Movie heroes swing swords non-stop for minutes while delivering witty dialogue. But real armored combat was exhausting. After a few powerful swings, most soldiers needed to catch their breath. Visibility inside helmets was limited. Heat built up quickly. The weight of equipment drained energy with every step. Soldiers fought in short bursts, conserving stamina and positioning themselves carefully. Finally, real battlefields were crowded, dirty, and suffocating. There was no empty space for a duel. Soldiers bumped into allies and enemies alike. Many fighters couldn't even raise their arms fully because of the press of bodies around them. Dust choked the air. Blood and mud made footing treacherous. Bodies piled up in narrow spaces, causing chain reactions where soldiers fell over both dead and living men. Many casualties occurred not through cinematic blade strikes, but through trampling, suffocation, or being overwhelmed in a pile. Movies ignore this entirely because it's messy and visually confusing, but it's historically accurate. Understanding these realities helps us see medieval warfare for what it really was: a chaotic, physically demanding struggle shaped by formations, discipline, and weapon choices, not glamorous sword choreography. Number 4. Medieval armies were not just knights. When movies focus on medieval warfare, the camera almost always follows a small group of armored knights riding into battle at the front, as if they alone are the army. But in real medieval Europe, knights were only a small, visible tip of a much larger and more complicated structure. If you were standing on an actual medieval battlefield, most of the people you'd see wouldn't be wearing shiny plate armor or carrying noble coats of arms. You'd see ordinary men on foot, peasants called up as levies, town militias with mismatched gear, professional infantry who fought for pay, archers with simple clothing and a bow, crossbowmen with heavy weapons and basic armor, and support staff who never even entered the front lines. Knights were important, but they were just one part of a much bigger machine. The backbone of medieval armies was infantry. These were the soldiers who held the line, took the brunt of charges, stood in shield walls, and formed spear or pike formations. Many of them came from rural backgrounds. They might be farmers who owed military service to a local lord, or free men from a town serving in the militia. Their equipment varied a lot. Some had proper helmets and mail shirts. Others wore only padded cloth or leather. Many carried spears or simple polearms because those were cheap, effective, and didn't require years of specialized training. From a commander's point of view, an infantryman didn't need to be a master swordsman to be useful. He needed to stand his ground, keep formation, and move when ordered. Archers and crossbowmen played a huge role too. Movies occasionally show them, but usually only as a quick arrow range shot before the knight's charge. In reality, these ranged troops could decide entire campaigns. English longbowmen at battles like Crécy or Agincourt weren't background characters. They were the main factor. A well-coordinated group of archers could break enemy formations, force knights to dismount, and make certain types of attack suicidal. Crossbowmen were especially feared in many regions because a crossbow could be used effectively with less training than a longbow and had strong armor-piercing potential at short ranges. Urban centers like Italian city-states or some German towns fielded large numbers of professional crossbowmen. Behind all of this stood a group that movies almost never show: the engineers and logistics teams. Medieval warfare wasn't just riding up to a castle and shouting a challenge. It involved building siege towers, digging trenches, constructing battering rams, assembling trebuchets and other heavy machinery, and hauling all of that across long distances. That required carpenters, blacksmiths, rope makers, miners, and laborers. They might not appear in heroic songs, but without them, many campaigns would have collapsed. Logistics also meant organizing food, fodder for horses, spare weapons, arrows, wagon repair, and even simple things like nails and rope. If the supply chain broke, the heroic army suddenly turned into a hungry, angry mob. Another thing movies get wrong is how medieval armies were put together. It wasn't one big block of knights from a single country. Real armies were often very mixed. A medieval English force might be led by an English king, but include Welsh longbowmen, Irish light infantry, Flemish mercenaries, and various household troops from different nobles. Each group brought its own equipment, language, and fighting style. Commanders liked hiring foreign specialists because they filled specific roles. Maybe one region was known for archers, another for heavy infantry, another for engineers. That diversity made armies stronger, but it also made coordination harder. Orders had to cross language barriers and cultural differences, something movies rarely bother to mention. The idea that all knights wore full plate armor is also misleading. Full, beautifully polished plate armor belongs mostly to the late Middle Ages, and even then was mainly for those who could afford it. In earlier centuries, many knights fought in mail armor, interlocking metal rings worn over padded cloth. Some had only partial plate, metal pieces on the chest and shins, but not on the arms or thighs. And even when full plate became more common, quality still varied. A wealthy noble might have a perfectly fitted Italian or German harness. A poorer knight might have older, reused, or mismatched pieces. Movies tend to give every knight the same high-end armor set, but historically that uniformity didn't exist. Movies also like to present every knight as a perfectly trained killing machine, but in reality, skills varied. Yes, many knights trained from youth in riding, hunting, and combat. They had access to weapons and time to practice. But that didn't automatically make them invincible. Some were talented, some were average. A few were frankly not very good. Young knights might be inexperienced and nervous in their first real battle. Older knights might suffer from injuries or fatigue. On the other hand, some non-knightly infantry professionals, like seasoned mercenaries or long-serving men-at-arms, could be just as dangerous, sometimes more so. Movies, however, rarely give serious attention to these ordinary soldiers. Number 5. Battles were rarely clean. Good versus evil moments. Another huge mistake movies make about medieval warfare is treating every conflict like a simple story of good versus evil, where one side is obviously righteous and the other side is clearly villainous. In reality, medieval politics and warfare were messy. People fought for land, money, dynastic claims, prestige, revenge, and complex legal disputes. From a distance, some wars were framed as holy or just, but on the ground, soldiers were often fighting for reasons that were much more practical and personal. Many medieval wars started with disagreements that would look very technical to a modern viewer. Who had the legal right to inherit a particular piece of land, who owed whom a certain debt, which marriage alliance was valid, or which noble title belonged to which branch of a family. The famous 100 Years' War between England and France, for example, wasn't a simple case of England bad, France good, or the other way around. It was a long series of overlapping claims, broken treaties, shifting alliances, and changing political interests. Nobles switched sides when it suited them. Towns negotiated their own terms. Sometimes even whole regions changed allegiance more than once. Movies also exaggerate the power of dramatic speeches. In films, a charismatic king or knight gives one emotional speech, and suddenly, everyone is ready to die happily. Real medieval soldiers were more pragmatic. They worried about pay, plunder, survival, and reputation. Mercenaries, which were extremely common, fought for contracts and money. If they weren't paid, they might refuse to fight, switch sides, or loot their employers' lands. Knights cared about honor and status, but they also cared about ransom opportunities and political rewards. Common soldiers cared about bringing something home to their families, or at least staying alive. A stirring speech might help morale, but it didn't erase hunger, fear, or unpaid wages. Before many battles, commanders did everything they could to avoid actually fighting. War was expensive and risky. Losing one big battle could cost a king his throne or a noble his lands. That's why negotiation was so important. Leaders tried to arrange truces, hostage exchanges, or even marriages to solve disputes. Sometimes armies faced each other for days or weeks, probing, scouting, and maneuvering without committing to a full attack. They might wait for reinforcements, try to starve the enemy out, or look for a better position. Movies simplify all this into a quick, we march at dawn moment. But real medieval warfare often moved slowly, with long periods of waiting mixed with bursts of sudden violence. Even when battles did occur, they weren't always decisive. Some clashes were small skirmishes or ambushes. Others were limited raids known as chevauchées, where mounted troops burned fields, destroyed villages, and attacked supply lines to force the enemy into negotiations or weaken their economy. These raids could be devastating for civilians, but might not involve any major set-piece battle at all. When you think about medieval warfare, you have to imagine not only the big cinematic clashes, but also the constant background pressure. Crops destroyed, livestock taken, roads unsafe, and ordinary people caught in the middle. Another detail movies usually ignore is how valuable prisoners were. Killing an enemy knight in battle might feel satisfying in a story, but in real life, capturing him alive could make you rich. Noble prisoners could be ransomed for huge sums of money. That meant that in the middle of battle, some fighters were trying specifically to disable and capture high-status opponents instead of killing them. This economic factor shaped tactics. A knight who saw things going badly might try to surrender to a respected opponent rather than fight to the death, hoping for honorable treatment and ransom negotiations later. Morale and psychology were critical. Soldiers didn't always stand and fight until the last man. Many battles were decided when one side lost confidence, panicked, and broke formation. Once a group started running, fear spread quickly. People at the back couldn't always see what was happening at the front. They just saw others fleeing and assumed everything was lost. Commanders tried hard to prevent this by placing trusted troops in key positions or by using banners and standards as visual anchors. As long as the banner stayed up, soldiers could look to it for direction. Once it fell, chaos increased. Real battlefields were also incredibly confusing places. Smoke from fires, dust kicked up by thousands of feet and hooves, the echo of horns and shouting, the clash of metal. All of this made it very hard to understand what was going on. A soldier might not know whether his side was winning or losing until it was almost over. Communication between different parts of the army was slow and unreliable. Orders might not arrive in time, or they might be misunderstood. Friendly units could accidentally attack each other. What looks like a carefully coordinated plan in hindsight often felt chaotic and improvised in the moment.